Hello and welcome to Woman Life Freedom Manifesto podcast. I am your host, Pooyan Aslani. Thank you for joining us today. On this podcast, we explore critical issues surrounding democracy, social participation, and the role of government, with particular focus on socio-political landscape of Iran. We aim to engage in meaningful conversation about building a society that upholds the principles of liberty and justice for all. Today, we have a distinguished guest who has made significant contribution to political philosophy, Professor Philip Pettit. Philip is the Lawrence S. Rockefeller University Professor of Politics and Human Values at Princeton University and also holds joint appointment as a Distinguished University Professor of Philosophy at the Australian National University. His work spans moral and political philosophy as well as philosophical psychology and social ontology. Professor Pettit is renowned for his influential books, including Republicanism, A Theory of Freedom and Government, A Theory of Freedom, Rules, Reason, and Norms, and his latest work, The State, which delves into political structure and their roles in ensuring justice and freedom. Before we dive into our discussion, I'd like to provide some context about Iran's socio-political history and the current landscape. Iran has undergone significant transformation over the past century, marked by major events such as Constitutional Revolution of 1906, the establishment of Pahlavi's dynasty in 1925, and the Islamic Revolution of 1979. Today, the country is experiencing another wave of demands for change, driven by issues such as gender equality, religious freedom, and political autonomy for ethnic groups. The killing of Jina Amini has sparked widespread protest, reflecting the urgent need for a new social contract that ensures justice and non-domination for all citizens. In this context, our discussion will explore how the principle of republicanism and the normative function of government, as articulated by Professor Pettit, can be applied to Iran. We also examine the concept of liberty as non-domination and the practical steps needed to move toward a republican form of government that addresses these critical issues. Professor Pettit, welcome to the podcast. It's an honor to have you with us. Thank you very much for accepting my invitation.
It's a great pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me.
Sure. To kick off our discussion, Philip, I would like to ask you basically if you could summarize the core principles of republicanism as you have outlined in the New Republicanism.
Well, first of all, I'd like to say that the Republican tradition has ancient roots, basically roots in Europe and also in the Middle East. And it goes back essentially to probably Roman thought, you might say, in the period of the Republic up to the before the rise of the Empire, which was about zero, as we say, in the Christian calendar, the Christian era, the Common Era. There are three principles, I think, that characterize the Republican tradition in that broad sense. And while it began in Rome, of course, this tradition was revivified at various points in history over the last 2,000 years. I would like to see a revival of it in our own time, and indeed, there is certainly a revival of it in more philosophical circumstances, and hopefully that might spread more widely. So, three principles. One is a particular way of thinking about freedom, which I think you want me to talk a little bit about. A second is the principle that if a government is really to advance freedom in that sense, and I call it, though it's just naming a traditional idea, not inventing a new idea, I call it freedom as non-domination. The second principle is that if the state is to really advance the freedom as non-domination that its citizens enjoy, then it had better be decentered in a certain sense. There'd better be different bodies within the state that interact with one another, that check and balance one another, where it's really important that one of these bodies, of course, is directly involves the people, the subjects of the state. And then the third principle is that in order for the Republic really to work properly, people have got to take the initiative, and they've got to be involved in invigilating government, keeping tabs on government, watching how government is behaving, and of course, when opportunity arises, of taking part in the governance of their own country. So those three principles: freedom as non-domination, a multi-centered, or polycentric, you might call it, a polycentric system of government with different centers and channels of influence, and thirdly, the participation and engagement of ordinary people within that system.
Thank you. But let me ask you a follow-up question, because in your book or your talk, actually, you have clearly distinguished between a notion that you call it new republicanism. As you have mentioned, well, republicanism is an old theory, or at least old theory of governance. But then you mentioned about, you talked about new liberals and how they see the liberty. And I would like to ask you, how would you describe that and explain the differences of these two notion of liberty?
Good. Can I do a little bit of history first?
Sure.
Because that's quite interesting. The notion of freedom as non-domination that I associate with the Republican tradition in particular was really the dominant way of thinking about freedom right down to, I would say, the late 1700s, the late 18th century. And then this newer way of thinking about freedom, this freedom as non-interference, I call it, the neoliberal way of thinking about freedom, then called the classical liberal way of thinking about freedom, came in basically as the alternative way of thinking. And I think these are, well, I would think of these as still in sharp opposition with one another. So let me see. The liberal way of thinking, or the neoliberal way of thinking, because some liberals, of course, in the American sense, they're very much friends of the approach I described as New Republican. But liberals in the classical sense, or in the neoliberal sense, they argue that in order for someone to be free, it's enough that they're not interfered with. And they are free just to the extent that they are not actually blocked from doing what they want to do, or coerced into doing what they don't want to do, or intimidated by others into not being able to do what they want to do. That's all that freedom requires. And that, of course, is a great deal. I mean, that sounds like a very good ideal in itself, and I wouldn't want to take away from it. But let me give you an example that I've often used in lectures and that people tend to respond to. I described the position of Nora, the heroine of a famous play by Henrik Ibsen, A Doll's House. Nora, it's 1870s in Norway. That's where the play is set. Nora marries a young banker called Thorvald. Now, Thorvald, under the law of the time, has more or less total power over Nora. He can determine what she does, who she associates with, what she wears, whether she leaves the home. He really is almost like a master in her life. However, Thorvald is deeply in love with Nora. He dotes on her, worships the ground she walks on. And so Thorvald gives Nora carte blanche, as we say. She can do more or less as she wishes within the cultural boundaries of the time. She can dress as she wishes, see whoever she wants to see. She can go to the theater. She can even choose a religion. We can imagine if she wishes to do so. Thorvald is not going to interfere. So Nora enjoys an immense range of freedom as non-interference. She's not interfered with in a whole range of things. I mean, she is pretty well off. However, here's the question. Is Nora actually free? I've asked that question of audiences throughout the world. And of course, in asking it, I've pointed out that Thorvald is free to change his will. He might turn hostile. He might decide that he might fall out of love. And did he do so? Of course, he might even begin to interfere. But at the moment, he's absolutely doting on her, and she's enjoying actual and very likely continuing freedom as non-interference. So is she free? And almost everywhere people respond, no, she's not free because she lives under Thorvald's will. She depends on his goodwill, his being well disposed towards her, to act as she herself wants to act. I mean, she acts as she wants to act. She acts according to her own will, but that's only because Thorvald allows her to act according to her own will. So basically, whatever she does with the implied permission of Thorvald. If he said no or whatever, or turned sour towards her, didn't like her anymore, that could all shift. And most people respond by thinking, no, Nora is not free. It's a misuse of language to say that she's free just in virtue of not being interfered with. And you might then ask, well, what's required for freedom? And of course, the answer in that particular case is pretty clear. Nora would only be free if she was not under the will or the power, the benign power as it happens to be, of Thorvald. She would have to be able, so to speak, to act as she wishes, regardless of what he prefers that she do. She should be not interfered with, not just because he likes what she's doing or likes her, but regardless of what he wants her to do. She should be able to act as she wishes, regardless of what she wishes in a given area, and she should be able to act as she wishes in that area, let's call them unobjectionable choices, regardless of what Thorvald wishes. And that means Thorvald would not be a dominus in her life. He would not be a master in her life. She would enjoy freedom in the sense of non-domination, of not having a master in her life, even a benign master. She can be her own woman, and that's what freedom as non-domination really requires. Of course, that's one specific context, as were the home context, but the same applies in the workplace, the same applies in the public sphere and society, and so on. That's the core idea.
Well, thank you very much. Then let me just ask you a few more questions, then I'm going to get back to this concept you just explained. In your book, the latest book you wrote, The State, you discuss actually three very important, I guess, issues. At least it's very important for me, and I think the majority of Iranians as well. You talked about the issue of justice, legitimacy, and social contract. Could you elaborate on this concept and why they are crucial for the stability and justice of a state? How do you see that these normative roles of government, and how do you define it for, I guess, our audiences in Iran? Because so far we have had the government and everybody has been in an, I guess, a position of, they call themselves opposition. There is oppression. But if you want to look into the future, and if we want to build a government of our own, how do we define these normative values or function of the government, please?
Well, I suppose I distinguish between what a state has to be, how it has to be structured, in order to count properly as a state, first of all. I distinguish that on the one hand from, on the other hand, what would make this state a just state. Okay, so on the first, when I say what's required for a state to count as a proper state, I should add one little thing, which is that, and really the history of political thought bears out this idea, which is that a regime counts as a state only insofar as there is a relative balance of power between the ruled and the rulers. If there's no balance whatsoever, if the rulers just rule by sheer terror of force, if it's a reign of terror, then I don't count that as a state. In order to be a state, there has to be some balance. Now, that can be very imperfect. It may only be some people among the ruled who can assert themselves against the rulers, but there has to be some balance of that kind. And what I argue in that book on the state is that, well, two things. To begin with, first of all, I think states are inescapable, and we should really not waste our time thinking about what a just world would be like in which there were no states whatsoever. States are now a matter of historical necessity. There's no way we can back away from them. So that's why I'm interested in, well, what's required of a state, at least a state in that minimal sense, distinct from a reign of terror. And what I argue in the book is what's required is that it should establish a system of law under which people, at least those who count as full citizens, because unfortunately unjust states can treat others as not full citizens, it should at least be a regime that imposes a law, a system of law under which citizens, in that sense, know where they stand relative to one another, but also relative to their rulers. And that already, so I argue in the book, already puts constraints on how a state needs ideally to be structured. But now I distinguish those requirements, so to speak, of statehood from the requirements of justice. The reason for doing so, and I've only begun to do this in my recent work really, is that I think it's important in recognizing what freedom requires and what justice requires, to recognize that it can only be delivered by the state. So to think about the nature of justice and the demands of justice, and the nature of freedom and the demands of freedom, has to be thinking about what the state might do in order to enable people to enjoy freedom and justice. And then that's the more normative one, the theory of what justice requires of this structurally characterized entity we call the state.
Well, thank you very much. And let me then ask you another, I guess, question or another phrase that everybody talks about it, and especially nowadays Iranians. And that goes back to the, I guess, the concept of democracy. The majority of Iranians, or many Iranians, often thinks that a free and fair election will solve the issue of democracy. In fact, there is a big opposition against the current regime in Iran. Some segment of them call themselves Republicans, but if you actually focus on their notion of liberty, as you mentioned earlier, they think liberty more of a new liberal definition of non-interference. And then we have some royalists that they don't talk about the Republican part of, I guess, the government. They just focus on democracy without explaining what democracy means. But if you basically ask them, they just quickly say, well, it's a free and fair election, therefore we will have democracy. In that regard, I wanted to ask you, how do you define democracy in your new republicanism, and how does it differ from the version advocated by new liberals in the context of liberty that you explained? And then especially when you said that the state basically has that responsibility of making sure that there is justice in the society, and that responsibility before, I guess, we are as Iranian, we are, I guess, in a pre-statehood, consider that the current regime, based on what you said, well, it's not legitimate. There is no question about that. But if we want to basically establish a legitimate government, how do we go about it, the concept of democracy?
Okay, that's a very big question. Can I just back up a little bit?
Sure.
To say the following. If you think that it's important that people not suffer domination in their lives, and you also accept equality, that the people under a state ought to be equal, those who are at least permanent adult members, able-minded members of the state, ought to operate as equals in relation to the state. And then you say that, well, each of those ideally should enjoy freedom as non-domination. That requires two things. One is you've got to say, what are the choices? I called them earlier the unobjectionable choices. What are the choices in which they should not be dominated? After all, if someone wants to kill another person, we have no problem about interfering with that potential killer, because he's seeking to exercise an objectionable choice, objectionable to others. But a first issue is, what are the unobjectionable choices that ought to be available to someone who is not dominated? in their lives among other citizens. Unobjectionable choices, the traditional Republican term for that is the basic liberties. What are the basic liberties that should be defined as this is the area where everyone should enjoy freedom? But the second thing, the first thing then that has to happen is that they're defined, and the second thing that has to happen is that people are protected in the exercise of their basic liberties, in the exercise of those of unobjectionable choices. So, for example, Nora would have to be protected against Torvald deciding he didn't want her to go to the theater or whatever on her own with a friend. That would have to be protected. You'd have to have some sort of pushback against Thorvald in order for her to really enjoy that freedom. Or take freedom of speech. In order to enjoy freedom of speech, it's not enough that there are a lot of powers around who might stop you, like an employer or a husband or a wife for that matter, but they choose not to interfere. That wouldn't give you freedom of speech. It has to be protected. So how do we both define the basic liberties and then defend the basic liberties? And that's where the state clearly has to operate. The job of the state, and I think that's the functional job of the state, as I said, is to establish a system of law. The job of a just state is to establish a system of law that defines the basic liberties for each citizen, qua citizen, and then puts in place laws and other measures that are required to protect them and secure them in the exercise of those basic liberties. Now, I call that the demands of social justice, the demands of justice as between people in relation to one another and in relation to private bodies like churches in their society or like corporations in their society, like employers, for example. Okay, that's every just state has to do that. Can I go on a little? I'm
Sure,
talking
please.
much on this issue, but just to now, you ask yourself, suppose the state does establish a system of law under which people know where they stand, and in particular, they know they can enjoy their basic liberties regardless of what others want them to do. I mean, they may choose to, in love or friendship, to restrain themselves, but they have that principled ability and freedom. Okay, but if the law is to define and defend the basic liberties in that way, then of course there is a danger, which is the law itself and the state that makes the law might dominate those over whom it rules. So let me give you a straightforward example of that. You could imagine, now it is imaginary, but you could imagine a colonial regime, say in the 19th century, operating, say, from Britain in, let's say, Africa. And you could imagine, I say imagine, it wasn't like this, alas, but imagine that that colonial regime really established for whatever countries involved, say in Africa, really established a law that enabled people to enjoy their basic liberties vis-a-vis one another in this way. If it did that, it would actually provide a lot in the way of social justice. However, most of us would say, but that's absolutely still unjust because the people in this country have no say over how the colonial regime is going to operate in determining law. And actually, they as a whole depend on the goodwill of that government because, after all, that government, colonial power, or it might be a despot, might change their mind tomorrow and might, cease to defend those laws. So not only do you, in a just society, do you have to have a law that protects you socially, gives you social justice, protects you horizontally vis-a-vis other people and private bodies, you also have to have a law that protects you, a regime that protects you vertically against those who make the law. And that's where the notion of democracy comes in. There's a lot more to say about that, but maybe you want to interrupt
No,
me.
please continue. And I guess if I want to add, I mean, this notion of democracy you mentioned, I guess it, just talking about the context of Iran, I mean, I think, and then you mentioned about the liberty as non-domination. I mean, the killing of obviously the uprising started like 2 years ago. There are three issues, like the gender equality, obviously men and women. I mean, women have not had the equal rights, and also LGBTQ community. We have the issue of religious freedom and ethnic group autonomy, political autonomy they're asking. So, I mean, you mentioned about that. So if you could, I guess, hypothetically speaking of these variables or challenges, how would you go about it, please?
Well, I would say, first of all, what you've just described, the gender issues and the group issues, so to speak, that's a failure of social justice, because it's not the case that each member of the society, male or female, belonging to this or that group, enjoys the defense of the exercise of their basic liberties as defined by the law. That's not the case. So straight away, there's a failure of social justice. The issue, though, is the second issue, apart from social justice, is political justice. And that's a question of how does the state have to be controlled by its citizens in order for it not to be a dominator in their lives, in order for them not to be exposed, so to speak, to this exercise of public power of a kind that is wholly discretionary or arbitrary on their part. And I mean, I think of this in terms of social justice is about private domination and ensuring non-domination privately or horizontally. Democratic justice is about ensuring vertically this absence of public domination, that you have a public world, a res publica, you know, a commonwealth, a public sort of business in which the law is not imposed in a dominating way. And I think of democracy as simply a system under which there's enough control shared among the citizenry, as equally as possible, for it to be the case that they set the terms on which government can actually make laws and impose laws. Government is exercised, as I put in the title of one of my books, on the people's terms, not at their own will. And then the question of democratic sort of institutions is, what institutions are required in order to constrain those in government and in order to make them responsive to their citizens, in order to make them to be servants of their people rather than masters of their people. And I think that elections are really important. That gives us a certain selectional control over those in at least the more general posts, that we elect those at regular intervals and that we are free to vote for anyone who stands, and everyone is free to stand in such an election. I think that's an important constraint. I actually think it's particularly important, not because it always selects the best rulers. It doesn't select the best rulers, alas. As we know, there are many democracies where we've lamented the rulers who were actually selected. But the fact that you've got a democratic system means that whoever is elected, provided they agree to operate by the rules of election, can be thrown out by the people if they're unhappy with that person. And they then have got to walk on eggshells, as we say. They've got to be careful not to get people in general offside. And that's already a heavy constraint on those in government. That's a democratic constraint. But, and this for me is really, really important, the Republican tradition in general, and certainly the new Republicanism with which I affiliate, would emphasize that electoral control, so to speak, over government by the people is only one channel of control. And that apart from that, it's equally important, for example, and this goes back to the polycentric idea, the multi-channeled idea, in republicanism, it's equally important that there be within the government independent agencies that really do hold one another to account, so that no one single agency, no one person, no one group can seize power and use it, so to speak, regardless of what how others are affected. If you've got that sort of internal division, that's really, really helps. And of course, associated with that is the ability of people to, an arrangement under which we will discipline government, because government is disciplined insofar as they have to operate in the checks and balances, and assuming the people are in a position to dictate or change a constitution if they don't like it, the checks and balances imposed are imposed at the people's will. They could actually change it, so to speak, at least if enough of them wanted to do. But equally, rule of law constraints, those are constraints on government, and they're part of democratic control over government. But apart from those, so there's selectional control or electoral control, and there's what I think of as disciplinary control via rule of law, via rights that people have, for example, via checks and balances, via a requirement on government and government agencies to give an explanation for the decisions that they make and to justify them publicly. Those are the disciplinary controls associated with democracy, apart from the electoral controls. But even more important are what I think of as the contestatory controls that democracy would have. That is to say, the ability of people between elections, first of all, to know exactly what's happening in government, to have freedom of information that enables them to know this, to have a reliable media that enables them to know what's going on, to have, for example, independent channels of information about how the economy is doing, to have independent bodies that determine, for example, the rules of election and the district boundaries and so on. Don't have a central bank that determines the interest rates that are going to be set rather than leaving it in the hands of the elected. These are equally very important sorts of controls, and they enable people to contest what government is doing via these agencies, but also they can contest it, of course, in public, in the media, in the courts, if the courts are independent, which they have to be under a Republican democracy, given the polycentric idea, and if they can contest it in the courts, in the media, and indeed on the streets. It's really important that there be. And I would say in relation to that contestatory aspect of democracy, that it's really important that there are NGOs, non-governmental organizations, that operate as public interest bodies, that keep track of what's happening in different areas of government, that inform people, that challenge government to publicly explain why they are taking this, that. And democracy in that sense, it's electoral, it's disciplinary, and it's contestatory. It involves many channels, many centers of power that all keep a check on those in government, those in office. And that, if it operates well, and in a way that's equally accessible to people that can activate these different devices of control, if it operates well, then it means that there isn't vertical or public domination by government over people. So you need social justice, but you also need democratic justice.
Thank you. Let me.
I'm sorry, this is turning into a lecture. I don't mean to.
No. It's really good. It's really good, and I'm just enjoying it, and I'm sure that our audiences will enjoy that. Let me ask you actually a little bit of another question, I guess, about a little bit some, I guess, practical. I mean, just always this kind of transition in Iran has been a question for me. I would like to ask you, even if you could answer hypothetically. You have critiqued John Rawls' social contract theory. Can you share your main points of criticism? And because I have heard, I'm just trying to ask this question because I have heard among Iranians, majority of them reference Rawls and his theory of justice, because you have mentioned about just state. So I would like you to basically talk about your point about his social contract theory and your critique.
Well, First of all, Rawls is a friend, so to speak. He's a fellow traveler, as you might say, with neo-Republicans of the kind that I guess I am. He's a fellow traveler insofar as the social policies, the social justice theory that he would defend is likely to be very similar when it gets down to details. I mean, I haven't talked about the precise policies that a socially just republic would instantiate, but I suspect, I mean, I have written about that elsewhere, of course, but they overlap in good part with the sorts of proposals that someone like Rawls would propose. The difference between the two approaches at that level is that the approach I think of as neo-republicanism derives, so to speak, all those policies from a single idea, the idea of freedom as non-domination, and then the requirement of freedom as non-domination. And I like that because the notion of non-domination is it engages the heart as well as the mind. I'm not sure whether you're aware of this, but Zapatero, when he was prime minister in Spain in the 2004 to 2008, he adopted republicanism as his philosophy of government and used my book in particular and had me do a review of his government in 2000, just before the second election, as to how well he had done, though I'd never met him. I mean, he'd read my work, but he'd never met me. So I know a good deal about him, but one of the things I was really impressed about in the Zapatero government is that this notion of no dominación, as it was in Spanish, really caught on. You know, it became a public catch cry. You know, people understood what it is to be dominated, and that's what they hated. What they wanted is freedom in the sense of non-domination. So what I like about the idea of this freedom being the anchoring ideal in support of a theory of social justice, and what I like about it in particular by contrast, I suppose, with Rawls's approach, is that Rawls's guiding idea, which is very, very attractive, I mean, really attractive in so many ways, his guiding idea is that we should have those policies in the system such that if we didn't know who we were in that system, we would want those policies to obtain. That I think points in the same direction in the theory of social justice in great part. But it's a very intellectual idea. You know, it doesn't have that grip on the sentiments of people. I think it's really important that a political philosophy has that hold or can gain a hold on people's feelings as well as on people's thoughts. So that's one contrast. The other contrast to me is actually more important, which is that it's really not clear how Rawls's theory goes when it comes to democratic justice. It's very interesting that most of his writing is really about social justice, you know, the ideal sort of constitution and system of policies and so on. But it always sidelines exactly how government is going to operate and how it's going to be controlled by people. What I like about the neo-Republican approach is that it gives you both a theory of social justice and from the same base, this ideal of freedom as non-domination, it gives you a theory of democratic justice as well. I mean, I've argued elsewhere, and other people like Cécile Laborde and Miriam Ronzoni, for example, have argued that it gives you also an ideal of international justice, but global justice, but we can put that aside for the moment. The thing is, it's a unifying sort of theory. That I suppose what I like about it. But I know that you yourself make a lot of use of the notion of a social contract, and it's been really important in a country such as Iran to generate. And there I'm wholly supportive, because you're not talking about the thought experiment that Rawls runs as to what we would contract into if we were in ignorance as to what our position would be in the society. You're talking about people actually coming to a consensus of, at a general level, about the ideas. I'm all for that. So I think before ever you get a constitution established, ideally you'd want a public discourse, public discussion, exchange, you know, in workplaces, in homes, in the public media and so on, in which notions like those of freedom, of non-domination, of the requirements of social justice and political justice get sort of aired, you know? And so I think of that as what you think of establishing a social contract prior to writing a constitution. Yeah, devising a constitution and then imposing it on people, that makes no sense. You've got to bring people with you. And by the way, if I can just wind onto that topic, I said there were three ideas in the Republican tradition: the idea of freedom and domination, the idea of a polycentric regime. We've talked about both of those. The third idea was the idea that people have got to be engaged with the system, or else it just won't work, it won't stabilize, it won't flourish. And that's really the theme I'm picking up by relating to your notion of a social contract being essential.
Well, thank you. I guess I mean, I know that you're very busy. I appreciate the time. I guess have two more questions to wrap this conversation. I guess that one in your book, The State, you talk about the state's involvement in economic policy. And then I know that there is this notion of a libertarian concept of liberty, and that obviously in the United States is very big, and how the government should be. But then you talk, because you talk about non-domination, you clearly and obviously talk about that domination also. And then I wanted to ask you basically, how can new Iranian government effectively balance its role in economic intervention while ensuring justice and non-domination? How would you explain this kind of, I guess, government's role or structure for our audiences?
Well, can I say two things about neoliberalism or libertarianism, whatever you want to call it, but that right-wing version of liberalism, as distinct from Rawls's version of liberalism. Yes. Neoliberalism, in that sense, it says, okay, to be free, we're free insofar as we're not interfered with. First claim. Second claim, government always interferes with us by means of imposing laws. The Republican will differ because he'll say, well, it interferes, but not necessarily dominatingly. It doesn't dominate if there's democratic control. But the neoliberal says, no, that's all interference by the state. So we basically should minimize the state. We should restrict it to as little as possible. You know, it's required for basic order, maybe law and order and so on, but we should restrict it. So minimize the state. And then on the other side, and neoliberals argue that by contrast with the law coercing us, when we enter employment or make relations with one another within the market, they're always contractual. But that then means, they say, that I'm not interfered with in entering them, so I enjoy perfect freedom as non-interference insofar as there's a market in place that operates independently of the state. Now, I think that, so the line is minimize the state, maximize the market. Now, by contrast, neo-republicanism sees the state as essential in order for people to enjoy freedom, because freedom requires secure non-interference, not just lucky non-interference. It requires that, and it requires this, of course, in the range of the basic liberties. So the state is essential. On the other hand, the state has got to be controlled, and that's where the democratic justice comes in. It's not a sort of wholly statist approach. It's the state's essential, but the state must be controlled by its people. On the other hand, the neo-republican view of the markets is certainly tolerant. Markets are really important. I think it's really important that there's room for initiative and for risk-taking, you know, in the privatized risk-taking in the market. We know that's essential for major enterprises that get going, major breakthroughs to occur and so on. That's absolutely clear now. But nonetheless, from the Republican point of view, the market can be a site of domination, and there have to be controls built into the market, basically by the law, which will guard against domination within the market. That includes, for example, controls in the relationship between employers and employees, or between corporations and the local communities, or between corporations and the consumers that depend on them for their services. And you need, well, I'd say you need two things. One is you need law that determines the employer-employee relationship in a fair way. And I hasten to add, I think also a law that would allow unions to protect workers in what is an asymmetrical sort of relationship between workers and employers. You need also restraints on corporations of a kind that we do not have at the moment. So is that sort of the neoliberal view as I see it? You minimize the state, you maximize the market. The neo-Republican view is you preserve the state and make it capable of doing its job, but you also control it. So it's not a matter of minimizing or maximizing. Right. You just moderate the state, you keep it in place. And with the market equally, you don't minimize or maximize it. You keep it there, but you keep it moderate as well, so that there isn't domination within the firm or between firms and communities and so on. That's a rather, again, these are very complex issues, aren't they? I'm sorry to skate over them. So
no, I agree. I mean, there are difficult questions, and just basically, I guess it's some sort of a food for thoughts for people, especially for us Iranians, that we want to overthrow a regime and introduce a new one. We must talk about these concepts and be clear about it. Actually, I would like to ask you the final question, and that's about actually what are your hopes for the future of republicanism, or you call it new republicanism, in emerging democracies, countries like Iran, or actually in broader perspective, the majority of countries in Middle East, they are struggling. And then how can your theory help guide these nations toward a more just and a stable future? How would you see that? How do you think that we are going?
Well, you know, I think it's really important that we preserve our visions and that we preserve our hopes around those visions. You give up vision, you know, then you live like a vegetable. You give up hopes, you know, you live in despair. So I would like to hold on to this vision of what the state can be, and indeed the world of states can be. But I also hold on to the hope that we can inch our way towards that. Now, I think at the moment we're in a very bad situation over the last 10 years, really, since the since the invasion of Iraq, actually. That was a big downturn, I think, in the history of the recent history of the world. In that period, what's happened is you get, first of all, very disturbed markets, so people are feeling very unsure. You also get political disturbance, of course, once borders are invaded. Once you get the invasion of Iraq or the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, everything suddenly gets to be destabilized, you know, or the threat to Taiwan from China to use force to reclaim Taiwan. All of this destabilizes the world. Now, and of course, on top of that, there are all the religious struggles and terrorist wars and so on. In that sort of world, people often respond to, if I can use a masculinist term, the strong man, you know, the leader who presents as you can depend on me, you know, who speaks with certainty about everything, who never seems to have doubts, right?
Right.
And who rallies support behind him as a result. And we have a lot of those leaders today. I mean, they often begin as democratically elected and democratically disciplined, but they sort of tend to shed the disciplines, like take Putin, you know. So, for example, the independence of the courts has clearly gone. There was there in his time. So there are checks and balances. The polycentric element has disappeared. But equally, the citizens element has disappeared because NGOs, for example, which would involve people contesting government, being involved in government, they now are all foreign agents controlled from outside. So they're swept away, and then you get this sort of single center of control. And no doubt many people in Russia probably think of Putin as their big guy that they're rallying behind, you know? I fear that Donald Trump is assuming a similar role for many people in the United States, which I think of as little short of tragic, you know? We'll just have to see what happens there. But you got the same pattern with Modi in India, with Erdogan in Turkey, for example, with Orban in Hungary. The same wish to, first of all, moderate the power of the courts to check them, and of other bodies to check them, and equally to deauthorize NGOs and citizens' movements against them. And unfortunately, in a time of uncertainty, people are willing to put up with that. I hope, though, that, you know, things will stabilize. And as they do, that suddenly these despots, which is really what they're at least aspiring to be, even if they're not currently, that these despots will lose that charm, that appeal for ordinary people.
Thank you very much, Professor. I appreciate the time you spent with us. And as I mentioned before, we will basically translate all these podcasts in subtitle in Farsi, and we'll also publish the transcript of this podcast in Farsi and publish it. Thank you very much.
It's been a real pleasure to talk with you, and also an honor. And I wish all your listeners, your viewers, well.
Thank you.